my mentor, and for the Professor Frede, and for the SURF staff and other SURF scholars that have given me their input on my project. So, the title of my talk is Agricultural Productivity of Different Social Classes in Late 19th and Early 20th Century Imperial Russia, a case study in the Central Black Earth region. I will start with a description of a Russian peasant girl before she died in the early 20th century. Lying on a mass of straw distributed over a wooden bench lay a wretched, emaciated girl of 17 years of age. Her hectic cheeks and sunken eyes, together with a hacking cough, told their tale. The girl was dying of phthisis, preceded by famine and scurvy. End quote. This description paints a picture of what Russian peasants had to go through in the 1891 and 1907 famines. One area hit hard by starvation in these years was the Central Black Earth region, consisting of 9 provinces and named for the black soil that made it one of the most fertile regions in Russia. The Central Black Earth region was one place where agricultural output was decreasing, while it was increasing overall in Russia by the early 20th century. During the 1905 revolution, it was also the region with the highest incidences of peasant disturbances. It made up 30.6% of the total from 1905 to 1907. These incidences mostly consisted of the peasants going down to a gentry landowner they had grievances against. They would then proceed to steal some of their property and burn their house in the hopes that they will never come back. Having these characteristics of the Central Black Earth region in mind, my research question became, what were the differences in farming between various social classes, and how did those differences contribute to the level of agricultural productivity in late Tsarist Russia, especially in the Central Black Earth region? To answer my inquiry, I will be discussing my case study on the Zhansky district in the province of Kursk. The study is based on the data I obtained from a government survey covering the years 1913 to 1914 while in an archive in Russia. I chose this particular survey because it is one of the few documents available that contains detailed statistics on what each private landowner and each peasant commune used their land for. Analyzing the data, I compared the two groups. My analysis suggests that there was an inherent problem in agriculture in the Central Black Earth region. The comparison shows it is not just that the peasant communes had worse agricultural practices than the private landowners, but those practices were unsustainable. And since peasant communes made up the majority of farmers, agriculture overall was unsustainable in the Central Black Earth. I would like to focus on 3 main points from the data that suggest this conclusion. Peasants were not leaving enough land fallow, private landowners had less livestock yet more meadows for grazing, and lastly, peasants were not restoring the fertility of their soil. Before I jump into my case study, I would like to give a brief history of Imperial Russia from the second half of the 19th century to the early 20th. On February 19, 1861, the Tsar Alexander II proclaimed a manifesto that was supposed to be a step in the modernization of Russia. It was the Emancipation Manifesto, and it finally freed the serfs from their landlords. Russia was no longer a country dependent on feudalism, except not quite. The Romanovs had a tendency to seek a way to modernize Russia economically, technologically, militarily, and even culturally. They wanted its power to externally rival those of the West, but they did not want everything that came with modernization. They did not want the free liberal societies that existed in the more industrialized Western countries. They wanted to limit democracy, freedom of speech, and human rights, because those hallmarks of a free progressive society would decrease their power within Russia. In other words, they wanted to keep the autocracy intact. So when it came to emancipating the serfs, they set up the terms in a way that did not completely free the peasants. The former serfs still had to be part of their commune, a peculiar egalitarian Russian institution. The commune evolved as a social safety net and a way to redistribute the land among the peasants. After the emancipation, the commune had to collectively pay for the land the government took away from the nobles and gave the peasants instead. Since peasants could not leave the commune until these heavy redemption payments were paid off, they were still tied to the land. Russia was primarily an agricultural state. The peasants made up about 2/3 of the population, and they were the primary producers of the grain. This was the grain the government was using to pay for its attempt at industrialization. One historian, J.T. Robinson, argues that the government saw the commune as a tool to control the peasants and keep them obedient to the state, until the year 1905 came. In 1905, starting with the cities, and with the countryside soon joining in, all of Russia erupted in revolution, until in October, the Tsar promised a constitutional monarchy with an elected assembly. Soon after, in 1906, reforms by the Prime Minister Stalikin were put forth to make it easier for peasants to leave the commune and acquire their own land. The end goal was to rid Russia of the commune and take steps to a more capitalistic system of farming. Robinson makes the point that there was most likely a political reason the government wanted to end the commune. He argues that the state must have decided that if the peasants had private property, they would come to appreciate that property, would start to respect the property of the nobles they had recently pillaged, and have a stake in the Tsar's government, which would protect their private property. By 1913 to 1914, if this was the goal of the Tsar's government, too little time had elapsed to establish such a peasant class. Though the number of private landowners among the peasants increased, the majority were still part of a commune. And if the goal was to establish a more productive capitalistic form of farming, Russia had not reached that point. In other words, though it was trying to imitate the West, it was not progressing economically. So what did agriculture look like in the unstable regions such as the Central Black Earth by 1913 and 14? By dividing the farmers into just two social classes, peasant communes and private landowners, peasant communal farming showed itself to be inadequate in the Subzhansky district in Kursk province. My first point, in 1913 to 1914, peasants were not leaving enough land fallow. At the time, both groups were practicing a three-field system of farming. They should be planting 1/3 of their land with winter grains, 1/3 with spring crops, and leaving the last third fallow, which is when you let the land rest and recover. To compare how each group utilized their land, I took the ratio of the land under winter grains to the land under fallow. So for every 1 unit of land under fallow, there was a certain amount of land under winter grains. This ratio should be 1:1. For the private landowners, the average was 1.05 to 1. So they were coming close to the 1:1 ratio. For the peasants, the average was 1.28 to 1, indicating that overall, the peasant communes were not leaving enough land fallow. While they were probably doing this as a short-term fix because they really needed more crops and they did not have enough land, in the long term, this means their land was not recuperating as it should under a three-field system. So the peasant communes were farming unsustainably. My second point, at the time, private landowners had less livestock, yet on the other hand, had more meadows they can use for grazing and hay. When one looks at how many horses, cattle, or sheep there were for every unit of land, the number was greater for the peasants and the landlords. For workhorses, for example, I found that peasant communes had 4 times more horses than the landowners. The fact that peasants had more livestock actually makes sense. During serfdom, the peasants would have their own horses, cows, and tools, which they would use for working not only their land, but their lord's land as well. After the abolition of serfdom, the practice stayed, except instead of being serfs, the peasants were hired labor now. A calculation of the percentage of meadowland of the total land shows that private landowners had more meadows though. While 12% of the peasants' total land was meadowland, for landowners it was 26% of their land. Thus, the peasants were encroaching on their meadowland to plant more crops, a phenomenon historians have noted about the Central Black Earth region. This might also explain why they were not leaving enough land fallow. They were farming extra land from the meadows, without increasing the land under fallow. Since they did not have a lot of meadows to feed their livestock, the quality of their animals must have been lacking. A study done by the government in 1900 on the condition of the peasantry in the central region supports that peasant livestock was not doing well. A commission reporting on the Kursk province noted that in this region, quote, the average weight of a horse is no greater than 18 pounds, while in America, the weight of a driving horse is about 28 poos, while a working horse is about 40. In England, they go up to 55 poos. Pood is an old Russian measurement, in case you were wondering. I'm sure that the little amount of meadowland available to the peasants' livestock contributed to their low quality. And of course, a very low quality of livestock means that peasants cannot be as productive as with healthy horses and cattle. And this leads me into my last point. In 1913 and 1914, the peasants were not replenishing the soil that well. First of all, since the quality of their livestock was lacking, the quality of their manure, one of the main fertilizers available to them, was lacking in quality as well. Second of all, when comparing what private landowners were planting to what peasant communes were planting, in my data, not one peasant commune out of the 132 surveyed planted clover, while several landowners did. Clover is useful in two ways. Not only can it be used for feeding livestock, but it also helps restore important nutrients in the soil. So a farmer can kill two birds with one stone. While several landowners might not seem like a lot, compared to the fact that none of the communes planted it, the difference is significant. This fact supports findings by historians and the 1900 peasant study by the Tsarist government that the central Black Earth region was not doing a good job in sustaining the quality of the land. In conclusion, an answer to my question is when comparing the two classes, peasant communal farming in the central Black Earth region was inadequate. And when taking into account the famines of 1891 and 1907, a very unpleasant picture is painted of the condition of the peasants. In order to become a modern industrial state, one needs a strong agricultural foundation. Russia did not have this foundation. The peasants in the Sudzhansky district were struggling and going through famines because they could not support the government's industrialization efforts. Though the Sudzhansky district was only a small part of the large Russian Empire, it was part of the most fertile region, which had decreasing output. That should be a red flag that something is wrong. In its attempts to modernize and catch up to the West, Russia emancipated the serfs in 1861, but it left the commune intact, thinking it could control an entire social class. Though the Romanovs hoped these controls would keep the autocracy intact, it actually meant Russia could not improve economically. And these controls and lack of economic prosperity led to the Romanovs losing their power. Because it turned out you can't modernize in some ways and not modernize in others. So in 1914, Russia was still economically backward compared to the West. Most peasants still belonged to communes, and in the central Black Earth region, which should have been the agricultural center of Russia, peasants were encroaching on their fallow and meadowland, and unable to sustain the quality of their land in general. Yet, thinking Russia could compete with the West, the Tsar, Nicholas II, decided to enter World War I. Russia was not ready to fight this war. Maybe with the agricultural reforms of 1906, it was starting onto a path to industrialization, or maybe not. We will never know, because at the time, Russia was economically fragile and it could not take the strains of World War I. By wanting to show Russia had international status, Nicholas II led his country to disaster and chaos, and its people could not take it. In February 1917, a revolution began. The Tsar had no choice but to abdicate. The 300-year-old autocratic rule of the Romanovs ended, paving the way for the Bolshevik Revolution in October, and then a violent civil war. By 1922, a completely different and terrifying regime